Hello, my name is Steve Nesbitt, and I'm the creator of the ULAT World Language Program. The initials ULAT, U-L-A-T, stand for Universal Language Acquisition Tool, and the program can be found, of course, at www.theulat.com. The ULAT is a 3-year world language program currently existing in Spanish and French, and soon in English as well, which contains over 300 lessons and hundreds of videos that are used for both instruction and for reinforcement. Most importantly, the ULAT respects the natural language acquisition sequence. That is to say, it replicates the natural means by which one learns one's native language. The natural language acquisition sequence means moving from developing the skills of listening and speaking exclusively for an extended period of time until the student has attained what I refer to as relative oral fluency. That is to say, the ability to express himself or herself at a fluent rate of speech and to comprehend speech spoken in at a conversational rate. And then only once that solid oral foundation has been laid, then moving on to an introduction to phonics, and then elementary reading, and then finally much later, generally at the end of the entire first year of instruction, to the skill of writing as well. In the ULAT, meaning is always conveyed visually and in context. No translations are employed, therefore no destructive links to the student's native language are encouraged. Delaying exposure to the printed word is so important. The danger of the printed word, which unfortunately frequently is introduced in traditional language programs far too early, prematurely. The danger of premature exposure to the written language is that text is frozen in time and therefore gives students the leisure to do some rather negative things as they consider that word in a leisurely fashion. First of all, when a student sees a word in printed form, before he or she has the ability to work with that word in an oral fashion, first of all, they're making word associations with their native language, with English. Secondly, they're memorizing translations of that word in order to be able to retain that word for later vocabulary tests, for example. And then thirdly, very damaging, they're applying their English phonics system to the pronunciation of that word before the proper pronunciation of the word has ever been drilled into them as the norm for that word's pronunciation. And so the goal of the ULAT is to teach students to think as does a native speaker, without any recourse to their native language nor to thought in terms of printed text. Well, how does the ULAT do this? Because the consequence of text-based instruction is text-based thought, which results in slow, awkward, stilted speech and a sense in the student of futility, that they really can't speak the language they're learning. So how does the ULAT avoid the pitfalls of traditional language instruction? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, everything is presented in a visual fashion and in context. The students see a video of a verb, an action, for example. And then they are taught to perform a gesture where they imitate some sort of a movement that represents the idea conveyed by that verb. For example, here's some of the first ones they learn. This is live. They would not learn them in English, but I'm saying them for your benefit in English. Live, make, listen, wash, say, prepare, eat, watch, like, put, take, and then many, many others. In fact, in the first unit, they learn the 60 most commonly used verbs in any language. So they see a video, they learn a gesture, and this gesture allows them to perform a motor activity as they say the word, and therefore retention is greatly enhanced. And the sense of the word, they're acting it out in essence without any recourse to their native language in the process. Thirdly, a still image is taken from a single frame of that video, and that image, that picture, thereafter will represent in the student's mind and in the ULAT's lessons that concept being expressed by that verb. For example, the verb to wash, they would see a picture of me doing this, and they would remember that this refers to the idea of the concept of washing. Fourthly, that still image is placed in sequence with other images of which the student has become very familiar. through the progression of ULAT lessons in order to form complete ideas, complete sentences with a subject, a verb, potentially an object, articles, etc. Then the student, once he or she sees this series of images and can form the complete statement, clicking on it to hear whether or not they were saying that statement correctly, they're presented with those same statements in the context of an accelerating video, which requires them to make the same statements but at an ever-increasing rate of speed, which does not give them the leisure to think in terms of their native language. Then once the students, through this process that I've just been describing, can express themselves in a fluent fashion within the limited framework of the vocabulary and grammatical structures thus far presented, then they're introduced to phonics instruction and then to elementary reading, while still developing the new oral skills, and then finally toward the end of the first year to written activities in which they see similar kinds of strings of images about which they can already form statements orally, and then they are taught at that point how to put those words in written form. Very significantly, if a student is first taught to speak the language and to understand speech spoken at a conversational rate, before learning how to read and write, the skills of reading and writing are far easier to teach than if that whole process is turned on its head and written work occurs too early in the student's instruction. It's important to point out that students must begin the ULAT program in the first year. One can't jump into the second or the third year having studied under a different system elsewhere. This is important for two reasons. First of all, very practically, the images that represent different concepts would be unknown to the student and therefore would make no sense to the student if he or she did not have that exposure to them in the first year. But more importantly, the ULAT insists upon laying that solid oral foundation with no recourse to the student's native language nor to printed text before ever moving into written activities. And so that it's first critical that that oral foundation of fluent speech be laid within the student. And therefore it's not possible to jump into the ULAT in the second and third. You must begin at the first year level. The first 15 lessons of the ULAT, lessons 1.1 through 1.15, are available free of charge for your consideration. We'll take a close look at the feedback section of the ULAT website, and you'll get a sense of how administrators and teachers and students have felt about the effectiveness of the ULAT program as they've used it in their school or used it as an independent study student. And don't hesitate to write to me if you have any further questions. You can write to me at theulat1@gmail.com. And last of all, thank you simply for having taken the time to consider the ULAT program.